Hello, and welcome to another week of inquiry in the adult learner. This week may seem like a bit of a hodgepodge by combining two chapters of Ambrose again. However, the common theme is that we're exploring attributes of the learner that have a clear effect on learning and that can be influenced positively or negatively by instruction. Issues of maturing approaches to learning and self-regulation are often viewed by teachers as being entirely up to the learner. Indeed, given that you can't really learn from somebody else, learning is primarily the responsibility of the learner. But that doesn't mean that teachers can't influence learning processes within individual learners, and that we can do that by either modeling learning or directly instructing learning strategies. It's also important that instructors don't allow bias, whether conscious or unconscious, to have negative impacts on learners. Here are 3 learning objectives for the week, also posted in the overview file in the module. And although all 3 of these objectives are important, I anticipate them to show through in your 4R submissions for the week. I want to highlight attention on the 3rd objective because I'll discuss this topic in a few minutes with an approach that is somewhat contrary to your reading about Ambrose et al., in order to provide a somewhat more holistic view of the complicated distinctions between the terms metacognition, self-regulation, and self-directed learning. The people within classrooms and workplaces are becoming increasingly diverse, and education and training programs are paying increasing attention to inclusive learning opportunities and multicultural awareness when working with students and staff and with clients in the global economy. A long history of studies show that college students' experiences of diverse peers decreases prejudice and improves understanding of the attributes of different people. Fewer studies have looked at the impact of these diverse experiences on learning, but a fairly recent meta-analysis of these studies show that there is a small but significant improvement in critical thinking and problem-solving skills, which are representative of cognitive growth over the time of the learning experience. And this happens when learners of diverse backgrounds develop interpersonal connections during learning. It is certainly rare that a teacher purposely designs curriculum, learning activities, or makes statements in class or in front of other people that are meant to disadvantage a learner or to produce an uncomfortable learning climate. However, these situations can arise unconsciously and inhibit learner success. I've provided links in this week's Learn module to 2 videos. One is a TED Talk, and the other is a Khan Academy presentation, which I encourage you, albeit not require you, to watch. Because I think they're really thoughtful and thought-provoking ways of considering unconscious bias and the climate for successful learning. Student backgrounds can also lead to insecurities and threats to success, and that may not be apparent to an instructor from a different background. Consider this student's autobiographical statement. When I first arrived at school as a first-generation college student, I didn't know anyone on campus except my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right buildings. I didn't even bring the right size sheets for my dorm room bed. I didn't realize those beds were so long. So I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. Now think for a moment, would a student from a family where parents and or older siblings had attended college before them have likely had these feelings of being so overwhelmed and isolated and so strongly affected by something like as seemingly simple as the size of bed sheets? Or to especially think about that they would remember this sense of isolation decades later after accomplishing many achievements in life and career. This is an example of what your reading in Ambrose refers to as stereotype threat. When a stereotype about one's group indicts an important ability, then one's performance in situations where that ability can be judged comes under an extra pressure, that of possibly being judged by or self-fulfilling the stereotype. And this extra pressure may interfere with performance. Your text mentions very classic work on stereotype threat that was completed by Stephen Spencer in his dissertation research at Stanford in the 1990s. To help you understand this concept, I'll take a couple of minutes to walk through some of Spencer's data. In one particular study of looking at student performance in mathematics, Students received instructions before being administered 2 tests that they were all viewed as being strong in mathematics. Here was the statement they were read to, before taking the test. As you know, there has been some controversy about whether there are gender differences in math ability. Previous research has sometimes shown gender differences and sometimes shown no gender differences. Yet little of this research has been carried out with women and men who are very good in math. You were selected for this experiment because of your strong background in mathematics. Both men and women in this experiment had similar distributions of scores on the math part of the SAT test and had taken similar college math courses prior to administration of the test that was part of the experiment. One group of students was additionally told that the tests they were taking did not, in previous experiments, lead to any gender differences. And indeed, men and women who received this information performed equally well. Test scores were very similar, shown in this graph. They were statistically indistinguishable. However, the other group of students took the same test without any other information about gender-based performance. The difference that appeared here in the second group confirms surveys showing that women are aware of a stereotypical expectation that they do not learn math as well as men. All of the students also took a survey related to anxiety, self-efficacy, and evaluation apprehension about the test after they received instructions but before they took the test. The women in the control group were much more likely to agree with questions that increase their evaluation apprehension and decrease their self-efficacy, such as people will think I have less ability if I do not do well on this test, or taking the test could make me doubt my knowledge of math. Your text also describes another aspect of individual learning approaches to learning. This relates to learners' epistemologies, which means where they believe knowledge comes from. Studies initiated by William Perry in the late 1950s and replicated in other contexts and with other learner populations since that time have demonstrated developmental stages in how a person approaches learning. The scheme reflects 2 interwoven dynamics. First is the need to confront and cope with the diversity of ideas and the uncertainty of knowledge when learning something new. Second is to make sense of learning processes in terms of internalized beliefs and values and the beliefs and values of others. At the lowest level, learners assume that all knowledge is certain, that it's either right or wrong, and that the right answers emerge from authority, teachers, textbooks, parents, clergy, etc. Once recognizing that there is uncertainty represented by disagreement among authorities, learners assume that multiple views must be equally valid, and there is no way to reach consensus. This is the multiplicity stage in Perry's schema. But then, heading to the relativist step, the learner realizes that there are logical rules that are used to reason through a situation, can be applied to an argument, and that knowledge is more than an opinion. The ability to apply knowledge to answer questions and solve problems is an expression of this stage in epistemological development. Finally, at commitment, the learner is able to integrate knowledge learned from others and with their own experiences and values to commit to their own acceptance of knowledge. To see what these developmental steps look like, let's consider actual statements by students who participated in a longitudinal multi-year qualitative study of undergraduate students at Miami University in Ohio. So for instance, Jim says, knowledge is right or wrong. If you know the information, you'll do well. It is easy because you just read or listen to a lecture about the ideas and then present it back to the teacher. Rachel, however, states, if somebody believed one way and I believed another, I don't know how you solve that. You can't just say this is the right way. For me, I just say, well, that's what you think, and I'll think what I want to believe. Another view comes from Kurt, who says, I guess when I say application, I mean it'll make sense. When you can apply it, you can take it into yourself, and I think I actually believe what the profs say. Not that I don't believe what my professors are telling me, but I can see it as being true instead of just listening to what they're saying and thinking that it might be true. Or a statement by Gwen, I don't care if people feel this or that way about it. But if they can support their stance and have some background and backing for that, to my thinking, that is valid. I then need to evaluate their thinking in light of what I understand and value. Here is how those 4 quotes, based on full interviews with the students, not just these single responses, were interpreted to fall within Perry's schema, where these 4 students were within these stages of epistemological development at the time they were interviewed in the study. I encourage you to engage with Perry's stages in an interesting way through the link to a Prezi presentation in this week's module. Particularly if you're interested in thinking a bit more about these stages of epistemological development, and perhaps connect them to your experience as a learner and where you might feel that you fit among these stages. While Perry thought that most college students readily progress to the commitment stage, or stage 4, longitudinal studies of students, such as the group from Miami University, show that progressing beyond stage 2, the multiplicity stage, is generally not accomplished until after graduation. Here are the results of that Miami University study, showing where folks were in the stages of knowing as they progressed through college and into their first year outside of college and in the workforce. You can see that actually most of the substantial movement to higher levels of thinking, to at least stage 3, didn't take place until after the students were out of college. People progress through Perry's stages at different rates, based largely on educational experiences and levels of discourse with diverse thinkers. A single person can be at one level in one topic area and at another level in another aspect of knowing and learning. Therefore, the concept of epistemological development is certainly applicable to adult learning. The last topic in this warm-up relates back to last week's consideration of the development of expertise and competence. Your text authors introduced the concept of stages of development of competence in an earlier chapter, which is also related to the extent to which the individual is conscious of their level of competency. Progressing through these stages is essential for effective learning, and yet many learners remain stuck in the incompetence positions on this diagram. Here's an example of what I'm talking about, this ability to determine what you do and do not know. So what you're looking at here is a graph showing the distribution of test scores on a psychology exam. And the students' scores allow them to be grouped into 4 quartiles, 4 groupings based on their test scores. And what's shown here is the average within each of those 4 quartiles. So the top performing students, the top 25% of the class, pretty much did perfect work on average. The bottom 25% almost got no points at all. However, before the test was scored, but after it was administered, the students were asked, what do you think you're going to score on this test? And what we can see is that the students in the top 2 quartiles actually perceived that they were going to do pretty well. In fact, in the very top group, did better on the actual test than they thought they were going to. But that's very different than the bottom 2 quartiles, where the students thought they were going to do much better than they actually did, leaving a very big gap between what was thought to be the likely performance on the test and what really happened. What this is referring to is this concept that your text is referring to as metacognition. An important aspect of learning is knowing what you know and don't know, so you can adjust your studying to better master things that you know that you don't have a very good mastery of. Strong students, strong performing students tend to have better metacognition than low performing students, which really begs the question of whether these students in the bottom 2 quartiles might have done better on the test if they had simply had a better understanding of the fact that they didn't know the material as well as they thought they did. The title of the paper reporting this result is rather humorous, and certainly is a no-holds-barred sort of title. Unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence leads to inflated self-assessments. In fact, I think in part due to the humorous nature of the title, the paper received a satirical award from the Annals of Improbable Research, what they call the Ig Nobel Prize in Psychology. which aim to honor achievements that first make people laugh and then make them think. Certainly the title of this paper may have caused you to giggle a little bit, but the result of the study actually makes you think about how learning success may to a large extent rely on how well one is able to monitor their own learning during learning. And that's what this concept of metacognition is really about, knowledge about one's own cognition, thinking about your own thinking, and really asking the question, what do I know and what do I not know? So let's take this back to your text reading for Ambrose this week. The principle in one of the chapters professes to be a focus on self-directed learners, and you'll recall that that's one of our central pillars of adult learning from early in the course. And they state that to become self-directed learners, students must learn to assess the demands of the task, evaluate their own knowledge and skills, plan their approach, monitor progress, and adjust their strategies as needed. They're equating that description also to that concept of metacognition. And in addition, they go on to equate self-directed with self-regulated and lifelong learning. While these authors are not alone to use the three terms self-directed, self-regulated, and lifelong as synonyms and to blur the distinction of these terms from metacognition, most learning scientists and psychologists do not treat these as synonyms. And given the critical aspect of self-directed thinking to our course title on adult learning and the objectives of the course, I feel that it is appropriate to draw attention to this inconsistency. I argue that this chapter of Ambrose is much more about metacognition and self-regulation than it is about self-directed learning. Let's explore some relationships between the terms metacognition, self-regulation, and self-regulated learning. The core meaning of metacognition is a self-reflective focus on the individual's cognition. The ability to monitor one's learning by saying, what do I know and what don't I know? Self-regulation, on the other hand, is a focus on behavior that results from the metacognitive monitoring. Sort of the voices in our head that make plans and set goals for learning based on what we feel confident we know or don't know. Self-regulated learning, then, is a marriage between that self-awareness of metacognition and the intention to act that's embodied by self-regulation. In other words, originally metacognition was defined as a cognitive process and self-regulation as a behavior. But they interact along a spectrum and is not so easily distinguished. And as a result, the terms are kept distinct by some researchers and blended together by others. And it's also important to keep in mind that neither the metacognition or self-regulation are completely separated from emotions that the learner has through some sense of self-efficacy to succeed. Therefore, connecting back a couple of weeks in our topics, we're seeing a blend of cognitive, affective, and conative functions of the mind. What Ambrose is really focused on is self-regulated learning. And the behaviors involved in self-regulated learning are involved in this graphic and are commonly assumed to exist in many learners, such as what is the problem? Am I planning correctly for how to resolve that problem? And then evaluate where the plan worked. Or the assumption that this ability to self-regulate exists in all learners may not always be the case. Therefore, it's helpful to consider the merits of asking learners to explicitly engage with the questions that are illustrated here by bringing them into instruction itself. So at this point, you might be saying, what does all this conversation about metacognition and self-regulation have to do with self-direction? We'll deal with self-direction in the context of adult learning in more detail in a few weeks. The concept is best known from the work of Malcolm Knowles as being an approach to learning where the individual takes the initiative to diagnose learning needs, formulate learning goals, and then identify the learning strategies to achieve those goals. As shown in this graphical illustration, self-directed learners start with drawing upon motivation. And that motivation really consists of two different parts. One is the idea that you're entering with motivation to set the goals and commit to doing it, and then also a task motivation. In addition, the motivation interacts with metacognition and self-regulation, leading, as you can see through the diagram, down to self-directed learning. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute. In two different diagrams now, Gary has shown metacognition and self-regulation converging to something else. Earlier, we saw it converging in a diagram to something called self-regulated learning, and now they converge towards self-directed learning. So why aren't these two terms synonyms, as Ambrose claims? Well, here's the distinction. Self-directed learning originated as a construct from the sociological aspects of learning, whereas self-regulated learning originated in psychology as a set of cognitive and behavioral processes, the cognitive being self-monitoring, the behavioral being the self-management, or respectively metacognition and self-regulation. Those were processes undertaken by the learner. Self-directed learning is the necessary awareness to direct thought and action toward achieving a learning goal. That goal is not necessarily set by the learner unless there is self-directed learning. Self-directed learners are for sure also self-regulated learners, but not all self-regulated learners are self-directed, and that's why we shouldn't treat the terms as synonyms. So that's the end of our warm-up video for this week. And as you incorporate some of these ideas into your reading, here's some things you might be thinking about. First of all, have you ever found yourself making assumptions about the characteristics of the learners that you're learning with or who you're teaching? Or noticing people making assumptions about you that might be perceived as a bias? Have you sensed stereotype threat yourself? If so, how have you worked to maintain high performance against that threat? Also, can you trace your development of understanding in a field through Perry's stages of epistemological development? And lastly, what evidence of metacognitive and self-regulating processes can you point to that show that you are a self-regulated learner? Have a good time this week in engaging with these materials, and I look forward to learning more about your perspectives in our 4R assignments. Adios.